So roughly 10 days after the current administration took office, there were tariffs announced for Canada, Mexico, and China. Canada and Mexico were their import tariffs were supposed to increase by 25%, and Chinese import tariffs on Chinese goods were projected to increase by 10%. As a response, for example, the Canadian government, what they did is that they targeted some goods, specifically orange, for example, orange juice, peanut butter, wine, I think also bourbon. And as you know, I think probably the idea for this retaliation was to target basically the states that had voted the most for the current administration. And after that, as you can see, there has been back and forth, a lot of announcements about tariffs, about increases. There's also this idea of reciprocal tariffs. Basically, the US is stating that whatever tariff our partners are charging the US, then the US has to charge the same tariff on those particular goods. Some of these tariffs have been postponed after negotiations or after talks. And one interesting thing that I want to point out is that not all countries have retaliated. We know the EU planned a retaliation, but for example, Great Britain decided not to retaliate against Trump's tariffs. And I will show you through the results that this, in technical terms, does make sense. So Prime Minister Starmer, he went to the Oval Office and he, explicitly said, we're looking forward to sign a trade deal with the US as a result of this impasse. So before I continue, let me just provide a general definition of what is a tariff. So, like if you open up a textbook or if you look up in the media, basically tariffs are, they're going to say that tariffs are a tax on imported goods, right? And so the idea is to make those imports more expensive in the local market. And this is a quote from CBS News from February 3rd. Basically, they're saying that tariffs are used for shielding domestic industries from foreign competition. All right. This idea of shielding, your domestic industry had a lot of strength during the 1970s, 1980s, when a lot of countries were trying to substitute their imports with domestic production. I think nowadays the world is more integrated in terms of global value chains. So we could say that besides in some way of shielding from foreign competition, tariffs also now serve as a significant source of government revenue, specifically for very small governments, island governments, which they don't have a lot of domestic production and they import most of the goods that they consume. So the tariffs that they charge could probably make up more than 70% of the government revenue, just to give you an idea. In the US, the Customs, Borders, and Protection reported collecting about $88 billion from duties, taxes, and fees. And I am going to give you probably an unpopular opinion, but I think some level of tariffs is needed. Why? Because you need that revenue to improve the screening of imported goods, right? So when a good is imported, you need to screen that good so that it doesn't, to combat smuggling, drug trafficking, and other illicit activities. And, for all those X-ray machines that you probably see in the media, you need money to fund that. And I think some level of tariffs could be used, they should be used to fund this screening activities. So now I'm going to focus the research on on US agricultural exports, right? And this graph, basically what it shows you is that from all US agricultural exports, China, Canada, and Mexico, they make up about 50% of the US market in terms of export destinations. So we would expect that if there's a trade war between those trade partners, there could be some significant effects in US agricultural trade. This graph shows you how the imports and exports between the US and Canada and between the US and Mexico has evolved. And I think this is something that has raised the concern of, current policymakers. So as we can see, US imports from Canada and also US imports from Mexico, they have increased more rapidly than what we export to those destinations, all right? And eventually, this will lead to an increased trade deficit, which is also a buzzword in the media. I can tell you that a trade deficit could be concerning if The way that you finance that trade deficit is through loans that you can't really pay back, and that would be a problem. However, if you're funding that trade deficit with increased investment from abroad, then probably the effects of the trade deficit could be milder, right? So what agricultural exports we mostly sell to China? As you can see from this graph, it's mostly soybeans that it's being exported. So as you could think, if there is a trade war between the US and China, what product is going to be targeted most probably by the Chinese government is going to be US soybeans, as it actually happened during the years 2018 and 2020. In the case of what are our major agricultural exports, or what are US agricultural exports to Canada and Mexico, actually there is no one particular good that we can pinpoint because the US trades a lot with Canada and Mexico, and it trades a lot it trades a lot of products between them. So it's very difficult to pinpoint one specific product that is being exported the most. So considering, all these proposed tariff increases on Chinese goods and the 25% tariff increase proposed on Canadian and Mexican goods, and also this idea of reciprocal tariffs, we're addressing the following questions. So what is the estimated impact of such tariff increases, assuming no retaliatory measures are implemented? And also what would happen in case there is a tit-for-tat retaliation from those trade partners? And also we want to know what countries and US products are affected or benefit the most under each scenario. So that's our basic research question. And now I'm just going to go in a little bit of technical details, which I don't want to spend a lot of time in this, but just to give you a brief idea of what we're going to do. So this graph is going to basically try to make the difference between something that we call a partial effect and a general equilibrium effect. So just very briefly, a partial effect is going to capture the sensitivity of a particular traded good with a tariff level, assuming that everything else stays the same. Right, like we are assuming that there's no adjustments in prices, incomes, or expenditures from the country that is experiencing a particular tariff increase. However, you would expect that since, you change the tariff, you increase the tariff, there's going to be a change in trading costs between exporter and importer. So there's very likely going to be an adjustment in prices, incomes, and expenditures. And so what we try to measure in this research is general equilibrium effects. And the general equilibrium effects are going to consider all of those adjustments in prices, incomes, and expenditures, right? So if you import something that is going to be now pricier, probably the price level in the importing country is going to increase, and also incomes are going to be affected, and so on. So we're going to try to capture all those effects. So also, what trade model that we use? Very briefly, we use something called the gravity model of international trade. This is a widely used model, and it's also used by the USDA to measure some of the effects that they try to publish for the media and also in their web pages. So in a nutshell, what this model suggests is that larger economies and geographically closer countries tend to trade more with each other. So for example, you would expect the US to trade more with Canada, right? Like so they're closer, they are large economies. Then you would expect the US to trade with El Salvador being further away and also being a smaller country compared to Canada. So there would be more trade between the US and Canada than between the US and El Salvador. Also, we're considering all trade costs that could take place between one country and another, including unobserved factors in this particular framework. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the data that it's being used. However, I just want to mention that this comes from reliable sources. So for example, the trade flows that we use to model the effects comes from the USITC. The most recent year that we have for the data set is 2019, and we're going to use that. The data set, as I said, it has been widely used, and it covers about 63% of US agricultural exports, so it has the major exporting goods. The import tariffs comes from the UN database called the Widths and Trains database, also widely used. And the tariff elasticities, which is related to the partial effect that we have to use to calculate those general equilibrium effects or those overall impacts, are also taken from a very widely used source of information, is this article by Fontanier, Gaimbert, and Orifice. That is the latest, and it provides product level tariff elasticities, or that direct impact. So now with the scenarios that we're going to model, we're going to assume that the US increases import tariffs on all Chinese agricultural goods by 10%, and on Canadian and Mexican goods by 25%. And then in this first scenario, we're going to assume that China, Canada, and Mexico do not retaliate. Like they just see the tariff increase and they say, you know something, we're not going to retaliate, and we're just going to let it be and adjust our production based on that tariff increase. Scenario 2 is going to be the same as scenario 1, with the only difference is that now China, Canada, and Mexico say, you know something, we're going to have a tit-for-tat retaliation. So meaning we're going to increase our import tariffs by the same amount for American goods entering our countries. In scenario 3, we're going to explore this idea of reciprocal tariffs, and the way I'm going to model this, or the way I think that it should be modeled, is that the US will apply the same import tariff that each trading partner levies on US exports of the same product. Now, when you talk about reciprocal tariffs, I don't think there could be a retaliation, because it's going to be very difficult to determine the amount that you have to retaliate, because it's a way of saying, like you're charging the same amount that I am charging. So maybe I don't know how much to retaliate, but let's look at each scenario a little bit more in detail. So scenarios 1 and 2 are, as I said, the same, but the only difference between them is that in scenario 1, there is no retaliation, and in scenario 2, there is retaliation from the affected countries. So just let me compare one and the other, and how it affects our trading partners and how it affects the US. So in scenario 1, if there's no retaliation, US exports to China, Canada, and Mexico, they could decrease by 6%. But if there is retaliation, US agricultural exports to China, Canada, and Mexico could decrease by 31%. Total US agricultural exports could decrease by 4%, or $3 billion. But if there is retaliation, that reduction could be up to 7% of $5.3 billion. Now, what happens to trading partners? So basically, as you can see, if there is no retaliation, what we estimate is that Canada and Mexico may experience no impact or even positive effects on their agricultural exports to the US, right? So what happens here is that some products, they have a very highly integrated value chain that extends between the US and Canada, and also includes Mexico. So for example, livestock. And because of that, the effects actually are positive for Canada, in the sense that probably they're going to export cattle that is going to cost more. I don't think there's going to be an adjustment in quantities of being traded, but more in the price of the good being exported across, between Canada and the US. However, if there is a retaliation, while Canada increases its agricultural exports to the US by 30%, again, I don't think this is quantity. This is just related to price increases. For Mexico, the decrease in exports is about 17%. So as you can see, probably for Mexico, it's not a good idea to retaliate in this case. For China, if there is no retaliation, they will reduce their agricultural exports to the US by about 40%. But if there is retaliation, they will reduce their agricultural exports to the US by 45%. Now, we'll have, through the model, we also measure something called real wages. So these are wages are adjusted for the cost of living. So just as a brief explanation, what we take into account when we discuss real wages is that we want to make sure that the dollar that is earned in Mexico and the US, for example, they are going to be adjusted for how much goods I can buy with that particular dollar, right? So without retaliation, real wages for Mexico could decline by 3%, but with retaliation, that decline for Canada and Mexico could go up to 4%. So as you can see, if these countries retaliate, actually, they could do worse than without retaliation. In the case of reciprocal tariffs, as I said, we assume no retaliation, and the countries that would experience the most significant adjustments in US import tariffs under this scenario are China, Mexico, Brazil, and India, right? So For example, from Brazil, there could be adjustments in cocoa powder imports. For India, it would be spices, if I remember correctly, and also nuts in most cases. So if reciprocal tariffs were fully implemented, there's also some goods that actually could see a decrease in the tariffs that are being imposed. In this case, basically tobacco products and tobacco leaves. In this case, if reciprocal tariffs are imposed, U.S. agricultural exports could decrease by 2% or 1.5 million. And actually, Mexico could increase their exports to the U.S. and to the world by as much as 20% in this analysis. So one thing to keep in mind, and what I think is going to happen with reciprocal tariffs if they're imposed, is that eventually you want to catch the attention of your trading partners and tell them, maybe we should sit down and sign an agreement that this is actually what happened during the first Trump administration, that the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement was reviewed, and then, it was signed and replaced NAFTA. And they reviewed the conditions of the agreements, and that led to a new agreement that we now have with Mexico and Canada. So now let's discuss the results a little more in depth. As we can see, retaliation might not be the best option in this case. So as we can see, Canada and Mexico, they could actually see reductions in their real wages if eventually they retaliate. The U.S. is a big consumer of products is the first consumer of products in the world. So as I said, it might not be the best option to retaliate. Some tariffs were actually in place before the current administration, and as we know, they belong to the opposing party. So this is something that some of the tariffs, specifically the ones for China, had already been in place before the current administration took over. So there is substantial evidence that free trade provides net benefits, right? However, what we do know, and also what the media has shown, is that while free trade creates new jobs, it also leads to job losses in certain sectors, right? So some sectors were probably, if there is a free trade agreement between the US and Mexico, some plants could be moved to Mexico, and eventually that will lead to a job loss. Some economists, what they say is that, but we probably lost these jobs, or we created more jobs than what we lost. But now the question I think that we have to think about, so that these ideas of, tariffs and that trade is probably bad, what we have to think of is, how can free trade benefits be redistributed, to mitigate the negative impacts on a specific industry? So for example, how can we help the people that lost their jobs due to this agreement, probably, how can they be helped so that their negative impacts could be reduced? And one thing that I wanted also to point out is that some of the current discussion on tariffs and even migration, they echo past debates. And one interesting point in history for the US was the 1992 US presidential debate. There were three candidates at that time. We see President Bush, he just came from participating in the negotiations for the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So he was a big proponent of free trade, right? And he was a big proposer of NAFTA. He defended NAFTA during the presidential debate. Ross Perot, which was the independent candidate, he actually opposed it. He had a famous quote, which I'm not going to repeat, but basically he said that the movement of workers from the U.S. or jobs going from the U.S. to Mexico is going to be so much movement that is going to create a very big sound. On the other hand, President Clinton, he had like a middle of the ground vision of NAFTA, but he eventually signed it, after he became president. So I encourage you to listen to this 1992 US presidential debate, and actually some of the ideas have been recycled, so to speak, or have been, they took place even during that debate. So just as an outlook of what the results might imply, tariffs impact each industry differently. So industries with highly integrated global value chains, such as livestock, may experience more severe negative effects. So livestock, for example, some livestock it's born here in the US, exported to Canada, fed in Canada, and then they're exported back to the US for meat processing. So if you have those highly integrated global value chains, then probably the effects are going to be larger than expected. So as we have seen, if Canada, Mexico, and China retaliate, U.S. agricultural exports could decline by 5.3 billion. So now the question is, okay, we're seeing that there's going to be this potential loss. It might be a good idea to call, your favorite senator or your family, your favorite policymaker and asking them, what could we do in case this happens, just in case. Also, very importantly, if tariffs are going to be used as leverage in trade negotiations, then we also have to start thinking what provisions should be included in those new trade agreements. Like, what do you think the U.S. should include in those new trade agreements so that we have, a better position in trade? Like, should we have like anti-dumping provisions? Should we have intellectual property provisions? Should we have, I don't know, any provisions that we can think that might be beneficial and to avoid any idea that we're losing in a particular trade agreement. I think one important fact to point out is that the US president has listened to industry leaders. So here I have made the example of car makers and also potash importers. They basically, realized that the tariffs that were being proposed or the tariff increases that were being proposed will actually affect them. So they contacted the president and eventually those tariffs got reduced, or they had even, they were postponed. Their application were postponed. So given that, it might also be good within every farming or agricultural producing organization to start thinking about what key concerns should be communicated to policymakers in terms of these tariffs or any trade shifts that might take place, trade shifts in terms of policy. So with that, I think thanks a lot for hearing me out. Here's our contact information in case you have any questions. And yeah, that's my presentation. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zurita, for your time and for that really fascinating presentation. I really liked what you had to say about the 1992 presidential debate. It's the same thing we see in economics time and time again about sometimes history repeats itself, and we can study these past patterns and help us think about the future. So we do have some time for some questions now. If anyone wants to ask Dr. Zurita any questions, you can type it in the chat. You can unmute yourself and speak. We're a pretty casual group here, so feel free to ask away anything about tariffs or questions you have about what's going to happen or what you think could happen in the future.
Yeah, this is Mike Doomer. I've got a quick question, I guess. Carlos, being up in North Dakota, do you get a different sense as far as it having more of an impact for your state? I guess, what are you hearing from producers? I know there's a lot more that crosses the border up there, and it seems, I guess, to me like it's going to have a bigger impact if we do see these tariffs come to fruition. What are you hearing up there, I guess?
So yeah, thank you for your question. So before we did this analysis, we started, these tariffs have been they were announced, or there were ideas that they will be announced if the current U.S. president won the election, which eventually he did. And I think North Dakota is a big soybean producer, and most of its soybeans, actually, I think we found out that 98% of their soybeans is reaching China. So if I remember correctly, the effect was quite large, specifically if the tariff reaches about 60%. It could be devastating for local producers here in North Dakota. In this case, what we can only provide is, what they want to know is how much they would, probably lose in case that there is like a big retaliation coming from China. However, I also do know that during the previous U.S.-China trade war, there were mitigation programs organized by the USDA, right? Like they were handed out a particular amount of money considering how much they lost given this tariff dispute. I think in a way they're trying to prepare for that, trying to create like a buffer zone for all the effects. But soybeans is a big concern, I think, in general terms, especially because it's mostly exported to China.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for another question. If anyone wants to drop one in the chat or unmute yourself, feel free. And if not, we can open up for some more questions at the end too. Alrighty, so thank you so much, Dr. Zurita, for joining us and for your great presentation. So next up, I'm going to present about the policy update and outlook. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. There's been a lot going on in this space, so I want to provide you with kind of all the latest updates and what I've been seeing in the data, what I've been seeing in the news, and just have a conversation about what's been going on. Alrighty, so today I'm going to talk first about the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program, which was just announced on Tuesday, all of the details, so I'll give you the latest information about that. I'm going to talk about the freezes and Doge cuts we've been seeing with USDA, and then I'm going to talk about Farm Bill and what we can kind of expect for the upcoming year and answer the age-old question, will we see a Farm Bill this year? Passed. Spoiler alert, probably not, but one can always hope. So first and foremost, the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program. So this is part of the American Relief Act of 2025. This was passed at the end of December 2024 by Congress. The idea is to provide market relief to farmers from both natural disasters and from the downturn in the commodity market. So we've seen a historically low time of commodity prices and higher input costs, which are really squeezing the margins of many farmers. So the idea is Congress would provide $10 billion in aid for those market conditions that were harming farmers, and then a little over $20 billion in aid to help with some of the natural disasters that farmers faced in 2023 and 2024. As we've seen with other programs, some of these payments have been limited based on the total amount you can receive. So if less than 75% of your adjusted gross income was from agriculture, you could receive up to $125,000 in assistance. If you receive more than 75% of your adjusted gross income from agriculture, you could receive up to $250,000. So this was passed on December 20th, 2024, and with the provision that these payments were mandated to go to farmers within 90 days of enactment. So that would make the deadline of March 21st, 2025. So just this week on March 18th, the details of that $10 billion of economic assistance payments were released. So my understanding of the program was that when it was announced, my understanding was that it would be directly deposited into farmers' accounts by the deadline date based on acres submitted to FSA. So when the program was announced Tuesday, it's actually a bit different than what I expected. So it's actually a program that farmers need to enroll in to be able to receive funding. It's called the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program. And again, that's to cover the increased input costs and declining commodity prices, which have put farmers in an economic pinch recently. And with the upcoming 2025 crop year approaching and still a long delay between any other assistance payments that are going to be coming out, like ARC PLC, and which may not necessarily be even triggered at all, the government wanted to give farmers some support to get them through these declining times, especially as we're approaching the upcoming crop year. So the enrollment for the program is from March 19th to August 15th, 2025. There are some rules to be able to enroll in this program. Again, this is a voluntary program. You don't have to enroll if you don't want to, but if you want the funding, you have to submit an application. And you have to meet certain requirements. So you have to be actively engaged in farming. You have to have reported your acreage to FSA for your crop year and I have a typo there, present plant, but I meant prevent plant acres. So those have to have been reported to the FSA for 2024 crop year. But no worries if you didn't report those, you still have time. As long as you get them submitted by the August 15th, 2025 deadline, you're still eligible to participate in the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program. And this is on a rolling basis. So as the applications come in and are approved, the payments will be issued. So my recommendation to farmers and to those who work with farmers are to get your applications in as soon as possible, because the sooner you submit, the sooner you will receive that economic assistance. So how exactly do you go about applying? So all eligible farmers who have enrolled acres with the FSA for the 2024 commodity year, they are being mailed pre-filled applications. So you would just need to look over your application, sign it, and submit it at your local FSA office, or you could also submit online. But if you don't want to wait to receive the application, pre-filled application in the mail, you can go ahead and go into your local county FSA office, or you can log into your government.gov login and populate those forms online and submit them that way too. So again, you don't have to wait to receive the application. You can go ahead and get that submitted. And as applications get submitted and approved, you will receive the funding. It's on a rolling basis. So the sooner you get it submitted, the sooner you will receive that funding. And the application deadline to submit anything for funding will be August 15th, 2025. So you need to, if you're interested in participating in this program, you need to get that in before August 15th. And the USDA has a really nice Emergency Commodity Assistance Program page on their website. And within that, they have this Emergency Commodity Assistance Program calculator producer tool. So you can put in all your eligible acres and the commodities, your prevent plant acres, and then it will calculate. It already has pre-populated all the payment rates for each commodity. And then based on the acres you put in, it'll tell you what to expect for each commodity that you should be receiving. And then it'll tell you your total gross payment, factoring in those limits I talked about earlier. So these are the commodities that are covered in the payment rates. So for our state, most of our acres, especially in the eastern part of the state, are corn, soybeans, and wheat. So corn acres are going to be receiving $42.91 per acre. Our soybean acres are going to be receiving $29.76, and our wheat acres are going to be receiving $30.69 per acre. But as you can see, there's a lot of different grains and crops that are covered, and across South Dakota, we have a lot of diversity in our crops as well. So for example, oats, barley, sorghum, all sorts of different crops are covered. So you can submit any of these crops to the Economic Emergency Commodity Assistance Program. And then if we think about how these funds are going to be distributed, especially by state and especially by commodity. So remember, we have $10 billion total for this funding program. Most of that funding is going to be going to Texas. They are estimated to receive $963.5 million. So 10% of the funding would be going to them. And most of that would be on cotton acres. So cotton is the commodity that has the highest payout per acre compared to all the other commodities. Most of that cotton is being grown in Texas. So most of that funding would be going to Texas, 10% of the total funding. And then next we have Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, North Dakota, and then in eighth we have South Dakota with a projected $497 million in funding expected to be received. And then we can look at that distribution of funding on a county level as well. I got these figures from the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center report at the University of Missouri. They put out a lot of great materials about this program and kind of the state and county level expectations of what we expect farmers to receive. So that's a great resource for people to use. I picked corn and soybeans since these are the two commodities with the most acres in our state. So if we look at the one on the left is corn producers by county, we can see a lot of that is concentrated in the northeast part of our state, particularly those two counties in the north that are the darkest purple. But again, it's correlated with what where the most corn acres in the state are grown. So mostly in the eastern part of our state, but you can see the concentration all across the corn belt as well of which states and regions would be receiving most of that funding. On the right, we have our projected economic assistance to soybean producers by county. So the darker the green, the higher the amount of assistance to that county. So again, you can see most in the eastern part of the state with a higher concentration in the northeast part of our state. And looks like quite a bit concentrated in southeast North Dakota as well. So another topic of discussion is, okay, after these payments are distributed, is there going to be more economic assistance coming, especially with all the talk of trade wars and tariffs? We know that farmers were really affected by that last time. What's going to happen to that? So initial payments for this program are factored by 85%, and they're limited to 50% on reported acres for prevent plants. So if all of these, after the applications are done and everything closes on August 15th, if there's still funding remaining after everything's been paid out, there may be a second round of payments from this program. On the other side, we have the natural disaster programs. According to what the Secretary of Agriculture has said, this will apply to both farmers and ranchers. So we will see ranchers being able to participate in the natural disaster programs as well. This will cover the 2023 and 2024 natural disasters, and will cover any natural disaster. So hurricanes, drought, flooding, anything across the U.S. that cause a natural disaster in agriculture will be covered. So we should expect some funding to our farmers and ranchers here in South Dakota for the natural disasters they faced in these crop years. And again, compared to the $10 billion for this economic assistance for declining markets and commodity prices, for the disaster aid, it's going to be more than double. So it's going to be $21 billion, and details of that program should be released soon, according to the Secretary of Agriculture. So keep that in mind. And again, it's important to remember that these programs are voluntary. You have to enroll to participate or choose to participate. There's often a lot of opinions with farmers I talk to. There's a lot of interest, but there's also a lot of diverse opinions about these programs and how they affect farmers and how they affect prices. So again, it's important to remember that this is voluntary, and if you're interested in participating in these programs, keep a lookout for the latest information and get your enrollment done as soon as possible. Now I want to talk a little bit about what we've been seeing on the freezes and the potential cuts at USDA from DOGE. What have they been cutting? Will it affect farmers? The first thing we saw frozen, or one of the first things I want to talk about that we saw frozen that could affect farmers, is the funding through the Inflation Reduction Act. So as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, there were some provisions for farmers, basically to help distressed borrowers and to expand some USDA conservation programs, particularly the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, and the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, ASEP. So you can see we had almost $20 billion for those USDA conservation programs and around $3 billion for distressed borrowers allocated to farmers through the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act was frozen by the executive order Unleashing American Energy. A federal judge ordered on February 10th for these funds to be unfrozen. And so on February 20th, the first group of funds were released, which were $20 million for EQIP, CSP, and ASEP to honor these contracts that were made to farmers. So farmers had enrollment contracts. They were promised funding for implementing these practices. And the funding related to paying farmers for the implementation of those practices was released. But the rest of the funding is still under review. As far as that's the latest updates I have as of now. But according to the Agricultural News, the funding related to honor contracts made to farmers has been released, which is that $20 million. whether the rest of that funding will end up being released or end up being canceled, I don't know. But considering what's been released is the contracts made to farmers, I would hypothesize that probably anything related to payments to farmers or contracts with farmers would be released. Another program that provided a lot of funding and with some funding going to farmers is the Climate Smart Commodities programs. So this was you may have heard a little bit about this. It was a $3.1 billion program funded through the Commodity Credit Corporation. It was a competitive grant program. And the idea of this program was to help enable climate smart commodity markets in U.S. agriculture. So try to help figure out how to quantify, monitor, and report greenhouse gas emissions, the benefits that agriculture provides, and then monetize and sell those benefits or incorporate them into the commodity markets to help add some value based on the environmental impact of some of these agricultural practices. So 141 projects across the U.S. were funded based on that program. 23 of these projects are located in South Dakota, they touch South Dakota. They're not necessarily led by South Dakota, but they affect producers in this region, and they cover 38 commodities and 95 different practices. So it's a little bit confusing how the Commodity Credit Corporation works, but it's a government-owned corporation that funds the commodity programs. So you may have heard about ARC and PLC, or the marketing assistance loans, some different conservation programs, livestock and disaster programs. So it's just the way that these programs get funding. And the Secretary of Agriculture, through authorization of the president, can release some of those funds for other special projects as well. So that's what happened with the Climate Smart Commodities program. Secretary Vilsack authorized and released this funding for this special grant program. So right now, a lot of these projects appear to be frozen from what's been going on at the agricultural news. So payments to a lot of farmers were encouraged to enroll in pilot programs through a lot of these projects, and they were promised payments to participate in these programs. So as far as what I've heard from people participating in the programs in the news, it appears a lot of this funding is frozen as of right now. There's a coalition of conservation groups that are suing. This is mostly over the Inflation Reduction Act freeze, but part of their funding is tied up in this Climate Smart Commodities program funding. So it is part of the lawsuit as well. I'm not sure what will happen with this. I think there is potential that this program could get cut or even eliminated based on some of the executive orders and the directions we've seen programs going, and the cuts we've seen, as I'll show you in some of the other USDA programs, cuts related to climate and climate change. We've seen quite a bit of that in other programs. So I think this program definitely is a target to be eliminated or changed. But again, what we've seen with the Inflation Reduction Act and these contracts and promises made to farmers for payments for the practices incorporated on their fields, these have been honored. So I would expect that there would be something, because there have been some farmers publicly say, that the not receiving the money for these contractually obligated practices they implemented has been problematic for their bottom line. So I would expect some sort of assistance for that or honoring of those contracts, even if this Climate Smart Commodities program gets eliminated. This is just one of the headlines that hit the news about these funds being withheld, and then some farmers did not receive the payments for the practices they've implemented yet. Now I want to talk a little bit about what we've been seeing with DOGE and cuts to the USDA, so we can think about maybe what to expect and will this affect farmers. So one of the areas we've seen cuts is office leases for USDA offices. So these are the agencies that have been selected for lease termination across the US. There's over 100 USDA agencies. So you can see we have some in South Dakota and North Dakota too that will be affected. It's important to note that doesn't mean these offices are closing. It could just mean they're relocated or renegotiating their leases, or maybe downsizing, moving to a different location. But this does have potential to affect farmers if these leases are terminated and these offices are closed. So that's one area of the DOGE cuts that has potential to affect farmers. So I went through the DOGE website and I searched all the terminations related to the USDA, and I didn't do any data analysis on them yet. I just kind of went through it and tried to see what topic areas are being eliminated and think about, okay, will these affect farmers, particularly the farmers in our region? So if you look at the cuts by agency, I posted this graphic from the DOGE website. You'll see USDA is number 7. So they have been a target of quite a few cuts from DOGE. And when I search all the contract terminations on the DOGE website, for USDA, they've had 93 contracts terminated and 178 grants terminated. But when I go through and I look at what's actually being terminated in those contracts, most of those are aligned with those in the presidential executive orders usually related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, or climate change, or some international work. There's been some funding for international programs in other countries working with climate change, or online news subscriptions and software subscriptions. So from my understanding, what I saw in the data, it's mostly related to those. It didn't appear to directly impact farmers. One area that is impacted directly to farmers is the local foods. So some of the local foods funding and programs have been cut. So there were some initiatives to help farmers sell their products locally, particularly to schools. And a lot of that has been cut. So farmers who do that or were planning to do that will be affected by those local food project cuts. Or again, the lease, if the leases end up being terminated and the offices are not relocated for some of those USDA offices, it could affect farmers in those regions. I was presenting some policy updates at our recent SDSU crop hour, and I got asked the question, will crop insurance be affected? Going through this data and looking at things, no evidence as of now that crop insurance subsidies will be affected. What I told the person who asked the question is, I think anything's up for scrutiny, anything's up for discussion, but I don't see any evidence in the data now that crop insurance is affected or will be affected. And I know we're running short on time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I just want to briefly touch on the Farm Bill. What can we expect for that? So since the 2018 Farm Bill was enacted, we've seen it expire and be extended twice. Most recently, December 21st, 2024, we saw the American Relief Act extend the Farm Bill through September 30th, 2025. So basically, Congress has bought some more time to debate the Farm Bill again this year. I've been through this process twice. Each time I've been optimistic we would see a Farm Bill that year. So do I think we'll see a Farm Bill in 2025? I think it's not likely, but there's always a chance, right? So what's next for the Farm Bill? Basically, the House has released a budget resolution. They want to make cuts of $230 billion over 10 years. Most of this has been focused on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, formerly referred to as food stamps. But historically, that's always been one of the big pain points in the Farm Bill, with usually some sort of compromise between the Republicans who usually want to cut SNAP and maybe increase reference prices in ARC and PLC, and the Democrats who usually hesitate on budgeting to cut the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So again, I could see that being a big fight. There's going to be new leadership on the House Ag and Senate committees. Both released their versions of their drafts of the Farm Bill last year. We'll probably see some updates and discussion this year. Another thing that's come up for discussion is there's been some discussion about putting parts of a Farm Bill in a budget reconciliation measure. So generally, the Farm Bill is a bipartisan effort. It's a bipartisan bill, so both sides have to compromise. If the Farm Bill is put into budget reconciliation measure, it could take away some of this partisanship that we've seen within the Farm Bill in the past years, but this would not be eligible to happen until fiscal year 2026. So kind of to wrap up, if farmers are interested in enrolling in the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program to receive per acre payments for the commodities they grew last year, I would recommend enrolling ASAP, because the sooner you enroll, the sooner you get improved and receive your funding. There's more aid to be coming to farmers for disaster aid. So since we had some natural disasters in our state, I would expect that South Dakota farmers would be eligible for that. Conservation contract payments to farmers through the Inflation Reduction Act have been released. But when it comes to other programs like the Climate Smart Commodities programs, those are still up in the air. DOGE cuts, from what I've looked through the database, don't have a direct impact on farmers other than those farmers involved with some of those local food programs yet. But it's important to keep a close watch on those, and the main effect could be through the termination or relocation of some of the USDA offices. If the Climate Smart Commodities program was frozen or eliminated, it would impact some farmers who are signed up to change their practices and receive payments from that program. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap it up, open up the floor for questions, and I will go ahead and stop the recording here too. So if anyone wants to ask questions off the record as well for Dr. Zurita or myself,